Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Institute for Government for our conversation with Sir Jeremy Heywood, the Cabinet Secretary, the Head of the Civil Service. I'm very glad to see a number of people who have interesting views on Cabinet Secretaries, current and past, in the room. I'm delighted to welcome one of your predecessors here, Richard. Delighted to see you here. And a number of permanent secretaries have interesting perspectives on what the role of Cabinet Secretary and Head of the Civil Service is, because it's a really misunderstood role. Not only because, by definition, most of the work of the Cabinet Secretary and Head of the Civil Service is in private, and only occasionally surfaces in various ways publicly, although select committees are now quite active on that. But also it varies from not only between Cabinet Secretary and Cabinet Secretary, but during the course of their tenure. Indeed, one of the interesting themes, of course, that Jeremy only became Head of the Civil Service 14, 15 months ago. So his job has actually changed in that period. And as well as the context in which he's operated changed substantially at the general election, having been closely involved in ensuring that the coalition's business was done. Now we have a single-party majority government. So that changes it very substantially too. It's also a time of significant change in the civil service and the recruitment, the pressures put upon it, the very scale of it. So there's an awful lot of issues to be raised. Jeremy's going to talk, make some preliminary remarks, then I'm going to be in conversation with him, and then towards the end I'll bring in some questions. Jeremy.
Thank you very much, Peter, and thanks very much for inviting me. Catherine Haddon tweeted just before I came over that she was looking forward to some Whitehall history. I'm not going to give you much history today. I think the time for history will be next year when the Cabinet Office gets to its 100th birthday and the Cabinet Secretary becomes 100-year-old as a role, so maybe we'll do some history then. But I'm sort of coming up to just 4 years in the job, and I wanted to really just take a bit of time this evening just to explain how I'm doing the job as we reach the end of 2015. So it's a sort of moment in history, not a long period of history. What I thought I'd do is just go through what I regard as the 8 functions that I have as Cabinet Secretary. Some of them Cabinet Secretary and Head of the Civil Service, but these are the 8 functions that I think I've got. I could probably have turned them into 7 or 9, whatever, but you get the point. So I'm just going to run quickly through those. I brought a few notes with me just to give you a few facts and figures just to enliven it a little bit. But I'm going to start with number 1, which is absolutely probably the irreducible minimum task of being Cabinet Secretary, which is to be the Secretary to the Cabinet. Very, very important role, of course. I'll give you a breakdown later of how much of my time I spend on this, but it's a surprisingly large amount. So what does this role involve? We've got about 200 people in the Cabinet Secretariats working on Secretariat business, some other people working on COBRA and handling emergencies and so on. But the pure Secretariat functions, about 150, 200 people, very talented people too. We have in normal term time, if you like, a weekly cycle. We meet on a Wednesday afternoon usually to discuss what ought to be, in our view, on the Cabinet agenda for the week ahead and 2 or 3 weeks ahead of that. So we have a sort of pipeline of issues. We put that together into a note, which I sent to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister usually disagrees with it or agrees with it, but with some combination of accepting the advice and tweaking it, we work out what's on the Cabinet agenda for the week ahead. It's a role he takes very seriously as well. We then prepare a brief for the Prime Minister, and then we have Cabinet itself, usually at 9:30 on a Tuesday morning, almost invariably about 90 minutes. Obviously, my job is to sit next to the Prime Minister and guide him through the agenda and so on. And then we have to write the minute, which I do with a lot of collaboration from my private office and my Secretariat team. But I spend a lot of time on it myself, as you'll see when we get to the time allocation. Typically, we're writing minutes of 5,000, 5,500 words, something like that. You'll enjoy the prose in 20 years' time, or whenever it is you're allowed to see them. But I take them very, very seriously, as I know all my predecessors did as well. But the job of being Cabinet Secretary and supporting the Cabinet, this function doesn't just end with writing the Cabinet minutes and handling the Cabinet. There's a very large chunk of work as well, making the Cabinet committee system work and making the whole system of collective responsibility work in an effective way. So a lot of the Cabinet's businesses, I'm sure you all know, is done through Cabinet write-rounds to the relevant Cabinet committees, ministers who wish to make an announcement about government policy that bears on other departments' interests, has an expenditure implication, requires legislation or whatever it might be. They have to get approval of their colleagues, and we have to make sure that those policy announcements have collective approval. So a very, very important role for the Cabinet Secretariat is to make sure that system works. No department no minister tries to get announcements out that haven't been properly considered by all the parties in government that need to take that seriously. So my job is to police those rules in my team, sometimes demand that they can't have a decision within 5 days or 2 days, it needs 2 full weeks and so on. It sounds a bureaucratic process, but it's bureaucracy in the best sense of the word. It is bureaucracy that requires due consideration to be given to issues in the interest of upholding cabinet government. So that's function number 1, the most important by far. We currently have 18 cabinet committees. We invent them, we close them down. We try and be responsive to what the government of the day wants. And I think that's probably a change of tack compared to 20 or 30 years ago. I'm told that in 1979 there were only 4 standing cabinet committees, for example. We've now got 18. And I'll talk about the 11 implementation task forces a bit later. So moving on, second function, advising the Prime Minister on policy. I've written here governance and civil service issues. Obviously a slightly distinct role from being supporting the Cabinet. This is advising the Prime Minister, and of course, for most of the last Parliament, also advising the Deputy Prime Minister as well. I had quite a significant role in that. So this could be anything. I'm one of a series of advisors to the Prime Minister, obviously, working very closely with his private office and with his policy unit, and we deal with important cross-cutting issues like immigration at the moment, or extremism, one of the big issues. The government's putting together an extremism bill, spending a lot of time on that. Ad hoc requests for advice on things like the Ministry of Defence's efficiency. That's something that seems to have fallen in my lap over recent years. One thing I don't spend a lot of time on compared to some of my predecessors anyway is national security issues. I do get involved in some issues, but we have a national security advisor now who is the lead permanent secretary in the Cabinet Office on most of those national security issues, although, as I say, anything of real importance I will obviously have an interest in, and I will quite often get involved in intelligence matters, and I spent a lot of time last year, for example, on the investigatory powers bill that required a lot of consultation with the big American communication service providers. So it's basically whatever is important, whatever is in the Prime Minister's mind, whatever is number 10's concern, where I think a senior civil service voice is needed. Some of that advice is given orally, a lot of it is given in the form of writing. I must write 5 or 10 minutes to the Prime Minister each week in term time, depending on what's live. But of course I have a real role in advising on all machinery of government issues. We haven't had many big mergers and acquisitions in Whitehall terms over the last 5 years, but you'd be surprised how many small machinery of government changes take place in a sort of normal year. I think something like 20 have taken place since I was Cabinet Secretary. Probably not one of them has been reported in the media, except possibly the transfer of responsibility for FOI to the Cabinet Office, which won't make any difference to the policy, I hasten to add. But so small machinery of government changes, civil service matters. Obviously if anybody needs to advise the Prime Minister on civil service matters, it ought to be the head of the civil service, so that's a job I take very seriously. And there are other odd ad hoc issues that come up, like sometimes you have quite contentious mergers and acquisitions in the private sector. AstraZeneca, Pfizer, for example, were partly because I spent quite some time in the city. I get involved in some of those and bringing together the departmental view. So, as you can imagine, a very wide range of issues on which to advise the Prime Minister. Third big issue, and one which gets quite a lot of publicity, not usually very welcome. Guardian of propriety and ethics, advisor on ministerial codes, civil service codes, special advisor codes, and custodian of the Cabinet Manual. My predecessor, Gus O'Donnell, invented this concept of the Cabinet Manual, or borrowed it from New Zealand. It hasn't really been updated very often, in fact only once. It's been turned from draft into actual, but at some point we'll probably have to update it again. It's supposed to be a fairly timeless document. But there's a lot of casework under this heading. Quite a lot of MPs write to me complaining about ministers' behaviour or special advisors' behaviour or sometimes civil servants' behaviour. Sometimes a media storm erupts over a particular episode that requires someone to look into it. We have leak inquiries, we have issues around elections, setting the rules of PERDA, been very topical recently, obviously. Around the time of the election, particularly important to make sure the rules of the game are understood. Spent a lot of time on that this time around. And then there are inquiries, Chilcot inquiry, the Gibson inquiry, where important conventions like protecting the papers of a previous administration, that needs to be upheld, and the Cabinet Secretary is the only person who can really uphold that convention, although it brings you into some controversial issues, obviously. So quite a rag bag of issues which require a lot of attention when issues blow up, require a lot of judgment, and a very, very important part of the Cabinet Secretary's role. No one else can really do it in our current system. Fourth function, driving the implementation of the government's priorities, commitments and projects. Really since 2001, when Tony Blair appointed Michael Barber as the first head of the Prime Minister's Delivery Unit, I think Number 10 and the Cabinet Office have been much more focused on the implementation of policy than was hitherto the case. So that the current government is no different from that. We have 517 specific commitments in the Conservative manifesto. Each and every one of those we have an obligation as the civil service to implement. Obviously, they range from really important, well, they're all, of course, very important, from very big, politically salient commitments to quite small things that you might have missed in the manifesto. But there are 517 of them. We have an implementation unit that is tracking whether or not they're being implemented. We have a subset of them which the Prime Minister has particularly sort of emphasised are of essential political importance to him. And I very much see it as my job as head of the Civil Service and Cabinet Secretary to make sure that we have a plan for delivering those projects, those priorities. That's what we're here for, to serve the elected government of the day. And so, for example, today I chaired my monthly meeting of the Civil Service Board, and we had a very good, our first proper look at this list of commitments since the election, since people have had a chance to sort of absorb them, and worked out which are the ones that look at the moment most likely to be sort of off track without corrective action or clarification. And that will be a routine that we do all the way through this Parliament, and we'll do exactly the same for the major projects. We've got 150 what we call major projects, 440 billion pounds worth of spending tied up in those projects. Each one of them needs to have a fully qualified senior responsible officer and project director. About 66% of them at the moment are green or amber. We have a red, amber, green rating system. Some of the ones that are red or amber red are extremely sensitive politically, very, very important. And again, we need to be absolutely sure we've got the full Permanent Secretary attention on those really critical projects and the critical programmes. So I have Permanent Secretary stock takes, I have departmental stock takes, I attend the Prime Minister's Implementation Unit meetings. Oliver Letwin, of course, spends a lot of time on this as well, so Oliver and I work really closely together on this. Very, very important part of the modern Cabinet Secretary's job, in my view. And I mentioned earlier we have these implementation task forces. We've got 18 cabinet committees, but we've also set up 11 implementation task forces chaired by ministers to grip priorities from the manifesto that require cross-departmental action, where a particular department doesn't have all the levers itself and requires other departments to act as well. So those are becoming an important part of the Whitehall landscape as well. And underpinning each of those, there is quite often an official committee that prepares the agendas for those meetings, tracks the progress and so on, and I chair a number of those. So driving implementation, I think, a distinct and important role. Fifth, leading the civil service of 440,000 people. For many people, this would be one of the biggest things they did. It's number 5 on my list. These aren't actually in any particular order. There's clearly a sort of business as usual element to this, which is largely in the hands of the permanent secretaries, who we'll talk about in a second, who run each department. And the role I play really is to sort of help convene a collective group of permanent secretaries to try and drive progress on the things we're trying to change. And I think most cabinet secretaries and heads of the civil service end up at one stage or other of their careers driving a particular set of policy changes in the civil service, because the civil service, though brilliant, and we can talk about that at length, does need to change in certain respects. And the priorities I established last September when I became head of the civil service, and the civil service board that I chair strongly agreed with these, were first of all to improve commercial capability, secondly to improve the diversity of the civil service, particularly at senior levels, and thirdly to mainstream, to use that ugly cliche, digital services. And I'm interested in lots of other things as well, but I'm really focused on those three things, because I think the one thing I've learned seeing predecessors in action and being involved with Bob Kerslake in the first version of the Civil Service Reform Programme for this tenure, I think less is more when it comes to reform. I think if you try and do too many different things, you end up doing not very much at all. It's not because anyone's resistant, it's just inertia takes over after a certain period of time. So I'm very focused on those three things: commercial, diversity and digital. I think we're making good progress on all of them. I'm very happy to answer questions on any of that stuff later, but in this introduction, I'll probably just leave it at that. In addition, we've got to do all of the implementation that I mentioned earlier, the 517, making these changes whilst saving £20 billion a year on top of the £20 billion we've already saved in the last Parliament in administration costs. So the fiscal agenda hasn't gone away. The need for austerity, pay restraint and making savings in administration has not gone away. So we've got to achieve all of the above with much less cost. And of course that's one of the reasons why we do need to do digital and commercial reform, because they will be enablers. But we've got to keep all of those balls in the air at the same time. I won't dwell on 6. I got 27 permanent secretaries who report to me, 26 plus John Manzoni, Chief Executive, and I've got 3 Directors General. And for each of those, they quite rightly need a mid-year review, an end-of-year review. I need to collect feedback on them and give them proper one-to-one feedback on their performance. And that is an enormous task. I mean, it's an enormous chunk of my time. Fortunately, it coincided this year with the general election campaign. So when people thought I was planning for the next government, I wasn't actually. I was doing end-of-year reviews for permanent secretaries, which is probably more enjoyable. In addition, we've got, roughly speaking, a batting average of about 7 permanent secretary competitions each year. David Normington sitting here, he does all of them. I do most of them as well. So selecting new permanent secretaries is another quite full preoccupation. So by the time you've added in giving appraisals and giving mentoring and doing feedback and filling out reports and doing 360-degree of feedback, and also the next tranche down as well, Directors General, because we want to identify the next group of 15 or 20 who are pushing through to become the next tier of perm secs and producing succession plans. You can imagine that it is true in the civil service as it is in the private sector. The senior leadership has to spend a huge amount of time on people issues, absolutely vital part of the job. 7 then, moving quickly on, encouraging innovation and continuous learning. This is probably the one on my list which is optional, but I've just put in there because I think it's really important. In my view, it would be okay, but not great if the civil service did all of the above and just sort of crept over the line. I want to see the civil service achieving all of its objectives, delivering on its efficiency savings, delivering the efficiency, delivering the implementation priorities and so on, reforming itself and doing it as the most innovative and the best learning organisation of its kind in the world. So what does that mean? It means particularly the areas which I'm most sort of personally involved in are the policy agenda, where I think I can't prove this. I'd like to be able to prove it, and that's one of our projects. How do we prove we're the best? But I think we are the best at behavioural insights. I think we're best at applying evidence through randomised controlled trials and the what works centres that we're setting up all over the place. I think we've thought more about well-being policy than others. I think we're doing more on horizon scanning than most. We have spent a lot of time in the last 5 years, and I've personally spent a lot of time building on Gus's great work on this as well. I should pay tribute to him. Really focusing on how we can use transparency and payment by results contracts and social enterprise and nudge and behavioural insights and evidence to make the British civil service the most innovative thinkers about policy anywhere in the world. And I don't go to many international conferences because we obviously have a tight budget, but whenever I do and whenever colleagues do, we usually find we're significant net exporters of ideas than importers. I'm always crying out. One of the reasons why I spend quite a bit of time on Twitter is I'm always fascinated to know whether other countries, other civil servants have got ideas that we can borrow. Because I think we should be an open, absorptive civil service. I don't want to sound arrogant, but I don't think there's much going on that we haven't already thought of and experimented with here. But I'm delighted to be proved wrong on that. So being innovative, being a learning organisation, it's an optional. I don't have to spend time on this, but I think, frankly, it's interesting, it's important, and I think it's vital, actually, if we're going to be able to make those savings and deliver the outcomes that we can for the country at lower resource. And then finally, we have to do things like this. We have to represent the civil service. We have to appear before parliamentary select committees. We have to go on visits to see what's actually happening around the world, happening around the country. And I've joined Twitter and I do blogs, and so this is a very much bigger part of the job than I realised a year ago. But I think it's an important part of the job. I mean, we don't want to steal ministers' thunder and hog the limelight. Absolutely not. We didn't come into the civil service for that. But I have come to realise that there is a representational side to the job, defending the reputation of the civil service when it's attacked, presenting the things that we're doing well. Making sure people understand what's actually going on in the modern civil service rather than just assuming that what they read in the newspapers is correct. And that's a very important part of the job. So I go on at least one, sometimes two visits outside London each month. I do about 50 speeches a year, many of which are public. I've joined Twitter. I've now got over 7,500 followers. I'm creeping up, still not as many as Bob Kerslake, so I've got a long way to go. But that's a number of my journalist friends have told me it's the most boring Twitter feed in Britain, which I take as a badge of honour. I don't do as many select committees as a number of my permanent secretary colleagues, not as many PACs, but I've got about 5 or 6 that regularly invite me to give evidence, 50 blogs, and so on. So really quite a big time commitment, actually. But I think important, but always you're walking a tightrope. I've also introduced this thing called Civil Service Quarterly, and if you haven't read it, please try and find it. It's an attempt. My wife works at McKinsey, and I've always been very impressed by the McKinsey Quarterly, and I wanted to have a publication a bit like the McKinsey Quarterly that showcases the brilliant work that's going on in the civil service. And there's very interesting articles in every, I'm not sure we publish it quarterly, but every few months we publish the Civil Service Quarterly. If you haven't read it already, please do. It's full of well-written, attractive stories about what's going on in the civil service, including some really first-rate research often. So then finally, I thought I'd just show you what that boils down to in terms of my time. This is from a sort of 4-month period at the end of last year, so it's still with the coalition government. So we've sort of finessed the difference between the Prime Minister and the Deputy Prime Minister, but it's after I became head of the civil service. And it's in the previous administration, but so I wouldn't say it's completely reliable down to the last decimal point, but it gives you an indication of how I spend my time, what my private office thinks I'm doing with my time anyway. So 25% civil service management, 13% permanent secretary management, recruitment and performance, 11% on cabinet business, 11% on PM/DPM meetings, 28% on policy and implementation, and 12% on external representation. So that order of magnitude. I think some of these, what's policy and implementation and what's a PM meeting, these things are fungible, but it gives you a rough order of magnitude. So that's what I'll say by way of introduction. I hope that's not too boring. Lots of process.
Far from it, Jeremy. An absolutely fascinating account of what you do in your job, and lots and lots of issues there. I mean, I thought on the pie chart at the end, it'd be very interesting to compare with some people who've been prominent in the private sector about how they allocate their time by comparison. Can I actually start off with, originally, when you were appointed, you didn't think you could be Cabinet Secretary and Head of the Civil Service, yet you've just outlined to us what sounds like more than one person can do. How can you do it now?
Well, we've appointed the Chief Executive of the Civil Service, which I didn't mention. Maybe I should have spent more time on John's job. But John Manzoni has come in as Chief Executive. He spends a lot of time as well on civil service management, and particularly on the efficiency agenda. So he runs. I line manage the permanent secretaries. He line manages the functions. So the head of digital, the head of commercial, the head of property, and so on. So a huge burden is taken off my shoulders, and having another very senior person sharing the representational burden as well is very important. And he's also become Cabinet Office Permanent Secretary. So, we've evolved the model again. He's taken on, as I say, the Cabinet Office Permanent Sec job as well. I simply couldn't do everything that I'm doing now, plus John's job, plus the Cabinet Office Permanent Secretary job. Not possible in my view. I mean, Gus did it, but he's God.
But also, in a sense, Gus had you at number 10 as Permanent Secretary, number 10 sentence towards the end of the period.
Yeah.
And which has, obviously shifted the burden in that way. Before coming on to that, how much has you shifted, as you said, the pie chart reflected the end of last year when there's still the coalition. How much have things changed with the absence of a coalition and now we've got a single party government again?
Well, they've changed in the obvious way, so we don't have a Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister bilateral every Monday to try and resolve issues. We don't have a quad meeting quite that same way. I don't have a regular meeting with the Deputy Prime Minister, so lots of mechanical things have changed. We have a government which has got a small but nevertheless meaningful majority and is determined to move at pace to implement. So we've probably moved more quickly into the implementation phase than might have been expected. And of course, the last year or so of the coalition government, there's no secret here, wasn't doing a lot of new stuff. So we've got a lot of new stuff to sort of turn into actual policy, and we've got right down to the task of implementation more rapidly. But these things, every 3-month period in my experience is different from the previous 3 months, so it's difficult to generalise.
No, I was thinking that in a sense, some of the collective processes had to occur in the coalition because the Lib Dems had to sign off things. So you had a much more, the committee structure being used, the quad and so on.
Yeah.
So is it a reversion to what it was in the kind of Blair era or something like that?
No, I think the Prime Minister, for example, the National Security Council is the best manifestation of this, I think. Believes very strongly in using cabinet machinery where it's appropriate and sensible to do so, and the National Security Council has become a permanent fixture. And the fact that he doesn't have coalition partners to bring on board hasn't changed that one iota. And as I said earlier, I mean, we've actually introduced a whole new raft of collective machinery, these implementation task forces, even though we don't have a coalition to sort of battle through. But he feels quite strongly, Oliver and I strongly agree, that bringing ministers together from different departments will help us remove the obstacles to the implementation of key priorities. So I think that, those good habits have lingered on.
Yeah, because we produced a report last year, as you know, Centre Forward, which looked at the structure at the centre. And in a sense, successive prime ministers have always been a bit dissatisfied with the centre and have changed a lot. A lot happened to the Richard Wilson's time, particularly in 2001, at the beginning of Blair's second term, when he changed things. But always people in your position would be very reluctant to agree to a prime minister's department. I mean, you were a permanent secretary without a department when you were at number 10. Has your view changed on that at all?
No, and no one's pushing for a Prime Minister's department at the moment, as far as I'm aware. That's just not an issue at all. I mean, we work really closely together, the Cabinet Office and number 10 as part of the Cabinet Office, and of course the Cabinet Office and Treasury as well. I mean, I think the centre is probably more united, if I can put it like that, than I can ever remember. So that issue has just completely gone off the agenda.
Now, you mentioned on diversity, and we are going to produce a report tomorrow on it, as part of the History of Whitehall project, which Catherine Haddon is in the audience, looking at the history of and looking at case studies, of particularly of prominent women civil servants. But there's been, the Hay report on talent last year suggested that civil service has become a less comfortable place for women since 2010, and there are quite big issues and challenges. Fewer women permanent secretaries than there were 4 or 5 years ago, and so. You stressed how many there were at senior levels, but there's still quite a way to go, isn't there?
It certainly is, yes. Definitely on women, but even more so, I would say, on BME and people with declared disabilities, for example. But, it is true that there was a short-lived period a few years ago when there were more female permanent secretaries than there are now, but only for a very short period. And I think we're making good progress on that. I mean, I think we've got... people have looked at our policies and they would argue that the policies that the civil service has got in place are as good as any other organisations in the world, and certainly in Britain. The issue is the application of them and getting that pipeline through. In the last 6 months, I think I'm right in saying 42% of the senior jobs in the civil service have gone to women. So we're still not at 50 in a flow sense, but we're getting closer to the 50%, and obviously we need a period of above 50% if we're going to get to a stock of 50-50. So I think we're making real progress on that. I'm much more worried at the moment on BME representation at senior levels and the harassment and bullying data that we get from our people survey from disability, from disabled people in the civil service. And we really do need to understand why we're getting such bad figures on that. But this agenda is very important to me. It's very important to Matt Hancock, the minister that I report to on all this stuff. We've got permanent secretary champions. I've got some very good external advisors on this that we've just appointed. And only tomorrow actually, we're going to be publishing a series of permanent secretary objectives on diversity by coincidence. So each permanent secretary has got 1 or 2 very specific objectives that they've agreed they're going to try and achieve in their departments. And I think that the net of all that, if this can be delivered, will be a further step improvement in our performance on this agenda.
Another thing on that role as head of the civil service, again the issue of skills and experience. That I've heard from some successive people in your role how important it is to have had whether it's called implementation experience or delivery experience or at least running something. But on the whole, it doesn't necessarily always go to the top. That hasn't necessarily been the necessary step to get the permanent secretary job. So what skills and experience are lacking amongst your colleagues every Wednesday morning then?
You're making a personal comment about my CV.
And your predecessor's CV. It's not a personal one about your CV.
I was co-head of investment banking at Morgan Stanley. Sounds very managerial, I'm sure. Look, I mean, you need a mix of skills. You need, and there's a mix of jobs, obviously. You can't run HMRC, in my view, unless you know how to run a big organisation with tens of thousands of people. You probably could run the Treasury without experience of running an organisation of 100,000 people. Questions whether you'd run it well, I don't know. But so I think we've got to recognise that a lot of these permanent secretary jobs, are, well, they're not all the same. We do have a blend of skills. We have quite a number of people who have worked in the commercial environment, who've been chief executives of local authorities, who have done operational delivery jobs whilst they've been in the civil service, running a big network of job centres, for example. So we do have a mix of skills, and ideally you would have that mix of skills coming through. And I think one of the many good reasons why we've got John Manzoni's focus on the functional agenda, as he calls it. It's a slightly ugly phrase, but basically we're trying to improve the quality of the commercial profession, the quality of the digital profession. I would like to see a lot of those people coming through and becoming permanent secretaries. There's no reason why the only route to becoming a permanent secretary is by being a sort of traditional policy civil servant.
Now, you mentioned digital, and that was the centrepiece of a speech the Prime Minister did a couple of weeks ago when he talked about the creation of the government digital services, the great unsung success story. But now we have big changes. I mean, several leadership of the government, of the digital service went, it's quite clear there was disagreement. How do you instill confidence that actually there's direction there? Because there does seem to be an argument between how much is done at the centre and how much in departments on digital.
I think that talk of an argument is really overstated, to be honest. I mean, Mike has, his great skill was as an insurgent in a way, and he's done a brilliant job creating a group of people and creating a brilliant brand, which has allowed us to attract some real talent from across the world, actually. But he was ready for a new challenge, and I think we're ready to move GDS onto into a different phase of its own work. And one of the many great things Mike Bracken did was help us recruit excellent heads of digital in all of the key departments, DWP, HMRC, MOJ, and so on, the MOD. You can't run the whole of digital. You can't run HMRC's digital strategy from the Cabinet Office. I mean, it's a vast organisation. Similarly, DWP and IT and digital is a core part of its mission. So no permanent secretary is going to be in charge of those departments unless they've got a real sort of grip on the digital agenda of their own department. It's so core to their mission. I mean, they're basically IT businesses. So, Mike quite rightly has seen it as one of his key jobs to build capacity in each of those departments and make sure we've got a clear whole of government strategy, but then we've got capability in each department to drive that forward, and that's exactly the phase we've now moved into. And so he leaves with a great legacy and a huge amount of goodwill. We'll still, consult Mike Bracken, and we've still got many, many brilliant people working in that part of the Cabinet Office. And I think it is absolutely vital that we sort of move it forward. I hope we'll get backing from the Treasury in the spending review, but that's not a bid. And we will, assuming that happens, you'll see a huge transformation, I hope, in the digitalisation of government over the next 4 years.
You mentioned the spending review and that. How the civil service has already been through enormous change in the last 5 years. I mean, you mentioned the 440,000. Well, that's a big reduction. How different do you think the civil service is going to look? I mean, you now travel around the country much more than you did before you took on the head of the civil service. You've been out of town this week. How different will it look and feel to civil servants?
I think it'll look quite different. I mean, obviously we'll keep our values, and I think no one questions those, and that's very, very important to say at the outset. We'll have a smaller civil service again. I mean, we'll definitely shed more staff. We're already at the smallest we've been since the Second World War, below 400,000 now on a full-time equivalent basis. We'll get smaller, partly because of digital. As you apply digital techniques, you need fewer people. That's just, as the private sector has found, as we've already found in the civil service. So we'll be smaller, we'll be more digital, we'll be more expert in commercial, if I have anything to do with it anyway, and we'll be more diverse. But I think it will still be the same civil service, same values. I think we'll probably be split up into the same number of departments. There's no great enthusiasm for reducing the number of departments. We'll do more joined up things. We'll have more. One of the big things that the government digital service have been pushing is government as a platform, a sort of jargonistic concept, but having a single digital platform on which all departments who are doing similar functions can base their services. So there'll be much more joining out behind the scenes, but the same number of ministerial brass plates and ministerial cars and so on, but a smaller overall civil service, more efficient and more effective.
How, I know you've seen the Scottish model, I mean, nothing to do with the political control in Scotland. You've seen the Scottish model of a unified civil service, which is, how attracted by that have you been? Or would that be reconciled with your joining up behind the scenes?
Well, I think we can probably learn quite a bit from the Scottish model, but the Scotland office that came before, the Scottish office that came before was quite a small government department by Whitehall standards, and they were able to be more fungible than individual government departments can be. But definitely we should try and be more joined up. I would like to see more social impact bonds, more outcome-based funding, more things cutting across departmental silos, more joint units. But it takes time to put in place all these things. So I hope you'll see more joining up, but I don't think we'll see a complete collapse of departmental boundaries when it comes to policy formation. I don't think that's going to happen.
Now you talk on policy. You've always, I mean, consistently, and it goes back to before you became head of the civil service, when you viewed it very much as part of your function as cabinet secretary. What you listed in that chart under obviously nudge and behavioural, but generally changes in policy making and what works. Some of that, and we've hosted the policy profession here a number of times with Chris Wormold and Oliver Letchard and so on, who listened to it and said, very interesting, do ministers get it? That there's a sense of, is this a kind of, not nudge, but some of the other stuff, particularly the what works, it's very much the civil service plugging into professional networks. And then you get special advisors working in a different world. Have you got it integrated with the politicians yet?
Well, I think ministers are customers for our advice, and they want to know they've got world-class advice. So in a sense, I don't care that much if they don't sort of question too much the plumbing works. What matters is whether the advice they're getting is compelling, whether their special advisors are saying, well, that's all very well, but what about this world expert over here who hasn't been consulted or whatever. We need to make sure that we know what the world's best thinkers think on a subject, that there aren't any areas of, aren't any questions about the advice that we're giving that we haven't thought about. And that's all part of knowing what the evidence base is, knowing who the experts are, understanding how behavioural insights could bring to bear, and something even more basic that I didn't even mention, making sure that the frontline practitioners who have got to implement policy are actually brought into the policy formation process at the design stage. So something as basic as that. So actually I think a lot of ministers do get this and a lot of special advisors do. And in fact, it's one of the, I don't want to say it's shaming because that's too strong a word, but it was embarrassing to me in a way in 2010 that it was a number of special advisors who brought a few of these techniques into government, and the civil service hadn't actually got there first. I mean, we'd had some conversations around the Wednesday morning colleagues table about nudge, but we hadn't really, I don't think, really appreciated its power. Steve Hilton, Rohan Silver and a number of others came in much more passionate about that than we were. So that was an important challenge. So it's wrong to say that ministers and special advisors don't get this or don't support it. Many of them do. But whether they do or they don't, it's still the right thing for us to be doing. And we need to be on top of those new trends. I mean, not just because they're faddish and voguish, but filtering out the things that make real sense and actually applying them in a sensible fashion.
Just something on the political context, or rather the parliamentary context. For a long time, the civil service has been used to working with governments with big majorities. And therefore, particularly, I mean, you saw this in your period, one of your periods in number 10, working with Tony Blair. I mean, the majorities are so big, didn't matter how many MPs rebelled. Now it's very different. And it's quite clear from some of the work we're doing here, some of the work we're doing on select committees. We just did a big study on the way select committees operate. It's also clear from the ministerial development work we've been doing with new ministers, which we've done a number of sessions with, that a lot of ministers feel that the civil service doesn't really understand their parliamentary responsibilities. It's not a technical thing to do with bills or anything taking a bill through whether teams are very good, but it's more the significance of Parliament for ministers. It's almost regarded as, you're taking the afternoon off or the evening off if you're going to the Commons, and that sense that there isn't enough understanding of Parliament amongst a generation of civil servants. And that oddly enough, comes across in our work quite frequently.
No, I've heard that as well, actually. I was at a dinner the other day when someone made that point. If people make that point, then we obviously have to take it seriously. But it does puzzle me slightly because, the route to the top of the policy side of the civil service anyway is still littered with people spending time doing bills, and it's one of the things which we pride ourselves on. You know, we say we're not good enough at commercial, but we do know how to get a piece of legislation through. Now, obviously, you're making a broader point than that, but I do think we take Parliament seriously. Certainly, you know, I'm very much part of the sort of number 10 meeting set up, and we're constantly hearing from the Chief Whip and the Leader of the House and the Leader of the Lords what the issues are of the day, the week, and so on. So you can't get away from it if you're working closely with ministers. So, you know, I don't really agree with it, but, you know, it comes up time and again. I mean, I do actually think we have become a bit rusty, and we're certainly on House of Lords handling. I mean, House of Lords handling is a major sort of issue for a government, which doesn't have, you know, much of a majority in the House of Commons, and no majority at all, obviously, in the House of Lords. So, and also some of the parliamentary practices do evolve. So, you know, there used to be a time when you thought you could rely upon, you know, an amendment being in order or not in order. That becomes, you know, at least seen from the point of view of the executive anyway, a slightly more fungible concept these days. So you've got to be slightly careful what can be in scope and what is out of scope. So, you know, as Parliament evolves and the Speaker gives different sorts of rulings, you know, we need to keep up with that. But we also certainly need to make it clear that anybody who wants to be close to ministers and advise in policy needs absolutely to understand the importance of Parliament. This is why you can't ever just assume that the way to get to the civil service is to operational delivery and commercial, because a very, very significant part of any permanent secretary's job and the senior official's job is to help ministers get their bills through Parliament. And if you don't have any awareness of that side of the job, you'll not be a successful permanent secretary.
What about looking at the other angle? I mean, one of the major planks of the government's approach is everything under the label of Northern Powerhouse. Decentralisation of significant chunks of the state's activity to groups or local authorities. And that's going to be significant for quite a range of domestic departments. Leaving aside totally the agenda of devolution to the separate nations. How can the civil service keep up with that? I mean, you know, there have been fashions in and out of regional offices and all that stuff.
Well, it's a very good question. I think I don't know the answer to it at the moment. It partly depends on, you know, how many equivalents to Manchester we get. I mean, I think the Manchester devolution agreement is a pretty significant change of stance, certainly on the part of the Treasury. But generally speaking, you know, is a new departure, and will definitely significantly reduce the power of departments in relation to the powers that are being devolved. Now, if it's a one-off in Manchester, I don't think it will be, but if it were, then that would be, you know, one thing. If most of the major cities of England end up with something like that, that's going to very profoundly affect the role of Whitehall. We'll have to adjust to that, definitely. I mean, but quite independently of that, I actually think that the civil service, the senior civil service anyway, is too London-centric. So I think, you know, without wishing to sort of try and shift work up into the regions for the sake of regional policy, I think just in general we'll be a better civil service if we have more senior presence in other parts of England, and indeed better relationships as well between the nations, which is a big part of another one of our initiatives.
Yes, I was going to say, because within the nations there are actually more civil servants working for the UK government in Wales than are working for the Welsh government. And I don't think the figures are quite, I mean, they're not just too out, well, in Scotland, although obviously it'll be shifted a bit by, I mean, DFID having a massive presence and leaving aside all the DWP and HMRC stuff, and that'll shift. How is it possible to retain a unified civil service any longer?
I think so, because I think all parts of the UK want to retain so. I mean, leaving aside Northern Ireland for a second. So we've recently embarked on an initiative with the full agreement of the senior civil service in Scotland, working with the Scottish Government, and as far as I can see, the Scottish Government itself, and similarly in Wales, to try and build closer links between the civil servants working for the Scottish Government, the UK Government, and the Welsh Government. I do think, you know, one of the benefits of devolution, in a sense, you know, it wasn't necessarily the reason why it was embarked upon, but one of the benefits ought to be policy experimentation, and I don't think we do anything like enough comparing and contrasting how the different governments have approached the same problem in different ways and getting the policy officials together on a regular basis. That needn't be politically difficult at all. So that's one thing we should definitely do. There are definitely economies of scale to be realised by all the civil services using similar sort of procurement methodologies and so on. And then I think just learning by sharing best practice, by being on secondment and having exchanges and so on, and doing training courses together. All of these ways in which we can all benefit from better collaboration. And so we've got Philip Rycroft, second permanent secretary in the Cabinet Office. We've promoted him to give much more oomph to this agenda. As I say, it's bought in by all parts of Great Britain anyway. And it's something I attach huge personal importance to.
Now you mentioned, just sort of before opening it up to questions, you mentioned of course next year is the 100th anniversary of your role and so on. But do you look back to any of your predecessors as kind of role models and inspirations?
Sir Richard Wilson.
Yeah.
Any question. I learned everything from him.
But the role has changed a lot. You work with a lot of them. I mean, when you were in number 10, you worked with a lot of several cabinet secretaries.
Yep.
Richard. You worked with Andrew Turnbull. You worked with Gus. And has the job? I mean, how, from your observation, the job's changed under you? It changed last year, and it changed after the general election, as you discussed earlier, Jeremy. But in broader terms, if you look back at how much the actual role has changed.
I think it doesn't particularly change as one person succeeds another. I think it changes depending on the circumstances and the tastes and interests of the Prime Minister. So at different phases, Prime Ministers get interested in civil service reform, and then the Cabinet Secretary, if he's also head of the civil service, has to spend quite a bit of time on that. Richard and I spent quite a lot of time working together with Michael Barber to invent the delivery unit. That was one of the things that particular Prime Minister was very keen to do at that time, and ditto a strategy unit. So a lot of the issues come back, but quite what you spend your time doing in any period depends very much on how the Prime Minister wants to run the government and what the issues are and so on. Also, I think probably Richard, you were, I can't remember, I think you were probably still in charge of the intelligence agencies, were you? So that's, as I said earlier, a big chunk of the traditional job that I don't do. I'm not the accounting officer for the intelligence agencies. We've got a national security advisor who currently does that. Sometimes it's been done by the chairman of the JIC. These things change over time. But in Richard's time, the Cabinet Secretary had a big role to play on that sort of thing. So it does, there's no sort of linear picture here, I'm afraid.
One thing which certainly happened in the last 35, 40 years is each Cabinet Secretary, their primary role, a lot of your roles you described here are by definition private ones. I said we wait for 30 years or 15 years or however quickly the minutes emerge. But it's to be a private advisor, but you get drawn into controversy. I mean, there's a nice historical twist with the new Australian Prime Minister, who, after all, his earliest surfacing in most memories was giving a rough ride to your predecessor, Robert Armstrong. Yeah. And I'm surprised no one's asked Robert for a quote on Malcolm Turnbull becoming Australian Prime Minister. It might be quite pithy. But inevitably, you're asked by Prime Ministers, and it's applied to all your predecessors, I mean, invariably, doesn't matter what party, doesn't matter, to do something controversial. You then get attacked in the media. You can't answer back. How frustrating is that?
It's very frustrating. I probably shouldn't comment any further.
Right. And since you'll never write your memoirs, it remains that was frustrating. But it's just a human thing. But it's interesting that it's excessive. Whatever, nothing to do with personality, it happens. Prime Ministers ask Cabinet Secretaries to do awkward things, don't they?
Yeah, well, it's rule number 3, isn't it?
Yeah.
Sort of the dustbin of sort of custodian of this, code of that, investigation of this. It is difficult because there's no one else really the Prime Minister can turn to on some of these things. I mean, we've got Alex Allen, another of our former colleagues, does have very useful roles to play on occasion. But some of the stuff you can't work, until you've worked out whether it's a sort of massive problem that's going to require a proper external scrutiny, or actually a small thing because the press is misreporting it or an MP's making a wrong allegation. You've got to do a bit of prior work, and that almost invariably falls to the Cabinet Secretary to do, and it's very distracting. It takes you off your day job, and you get no thanks for it. But it just goes with the job. So you either do these jobs or you don't. Yeah,
it comes back. You talked about setting objectives. And there's been quite a lot of controversy about setting objectives for permanent secretaries. That they emerged 8-9 months after the year started, and they were Christmas trees or things. And that's been refined. And
we haven't got them out this year, unfortunately. Yet.
No, you haven't got them out this year. I'm glad you pointed it out. But how on earth do you set the objectives for you? Because as you just said, you can get blown off course. Nothing to do with you, nothing to do with you getting up in the morning and saying, I want to do this today. Something ghastly happens and you get dragged in. So how can you determine, how do you measure your objectives? when you're assessed?
You just have to write a list of functions down and try and find some generic form of words which sort of more or less covers it.
Okay. But there is an element to which you're going to... It's very difficult to control, isn't it?
It is, yeah. You have to be... Look, I mean, but you do have to stay in formation as well. I mean, as I say, of course, I may get dragged into a particular leak inquiry or investigating Special Advisor X or Civil Servant Y. But at the end of the day, we've got cabinet to run, we've got processes to adhere to, we've got 517 manifesto commitments to deliver, you've got a civil service to run that needs to be more efficient and so on. In the end, those big outcome objectives have got to be what determines whether I do a good job or not. So you have to write the objectives in a way that recognises there's got a bit of flexibility and a bit of give, but fundamentally, I'm not doing my job if the civil service is failing to deliver the elected government's programmes. I regard myself as accountable for that.
Right, let's open it up to some questions now, particularly those who, very interested for those who have been previous observers of the role as either permanent secretaries or academics. So please, and also say who you are. Gentleman right at the back.
Executive MBA course leader, University of Greenwich. Well, my question is, as you look to the future, over the next 5-10 year period, what is it that you would like to see happen, but you also know will not happen?
I'm not going to answer that question. What would I like to see happen? I've already sort of said in a way. I recognise that we're going to have to get smaller because we have to become more efficient. But I'd like in 2020 for the Prime Minister to write as nice a phrase about the civil service in 2020 as he wrote in his manifesto in 2015. Because I think if the incumbent government thinks that the civil service has done an extremely good job at the end of its tenure or at the end of its 5-year period, then in a sense that is an important accolade to have. Of course, we serve not just ministers, we serve the public as well. We've got a vast sort of number of staff up and down the country serving the public the whole time, and all of those services, I want to see them getting better. But I think it would be wrong of me to speculate beyond that on things that might or might not happen, that I might want or not.
James Kidner from the Foreign Office. It's a rather specific question, but you talked about ever-increasing efficiencies, and we should all applaud that. There is one sort of change in government over the last decade or so whose architects now regret it, and that's the Freedom of Information Act and the way in which, certainly from within Whitehall, it feels like sand in the machinery that constantly distracts from the process of getting on and delivering policy agendas. Can you say what you feel you'd like to do to sort of take that sand out of the machinery?
Well, I think the right thing to do is to have an independent review by a group of very eminent people of the pros and cons of the current regime. I mean, I should probably stop there, but clearly there are some extra costs that come with the Freedom of Information Act, and there are some chilling effects, no doubt about it whatsoever, but equally it's been a very big positive. And I think in this day and age, the public doesn't stand for secrecy, and I think, frankly, that in most cases the civil service or the public service generally has got absolutely nothing to hide. There are small elements of national security or advice to ministers where it is best done confidentially and then best revealed at a later stage. The Freedom of Information Act basically recognises that. That was what the intention was. But I think it's for others to judge, this independent group of people that have been asked to look at this, and we'll see what they come up with. And the government will make a decision. It won't be down to me.
Vernon.
Vernon Bogdanor, King's College London. Can I ask a question about the Prime Minister's Department, which Peter asked? Other Westminster systems, like Australia and Canada, do have such departments. I think the Australian one is more political. They have a separate cabinet secretary and a Prime Minister's secretary, who I think is a political figure. Now, we don't have that. Now, are we different in some way from Australia and Canada, or do we in fact have a Prime Minister's Department within the Cabinet Office?
Well, it's a difficult question to answer, because it all depends on what you mean by a Prime Minister's Department. I just go back to the fact that this is not an issue at the moment. You know, of all the priorities I've got to worry about, I've got sort of 8 functions and lots more priorities underneath it. The Prime Minister isn't pushing for one. He's perfectly happy with the current structure. I think we've got bigger things to worry about, to be honest. And, you know, I've set out what my priorities are. I don't think we need to change the fundamental relationship between the number 10 private office and its supporting team and the Cabinet Office. It works very well in practice.
Right, just at the back.
Hi. Good evening. Hi, my name's Rob Neal. I'm Head of Diversity and Inclusion at the Ministry of Justice. Fantastic event, by the way, just to get speaking to transparency and opening things up and visible leadership. So thank you, Jeremy.
Good.
I'd like to pick up on something Peter mentioned about one of your priorities around diversity.
Yeah.
It won't surprise you to hear, as the Head of Diversity and Inclusion. I've been in the civil service for 32 years. I do like to pause at that point because I know I don't look old enough. Maybe that's an advert for the civil service, I don't know. But my question, Jeremy, is around diversity staff networks and the value that they potentially offer in all of the organisations. I just wondered, what with the advent of removing a barriers programme and some of the work that's going on there, whether you had any personal views about the value of those intrinsic owners of some of these issues and how we can perhaps best encourage those individuals collectively as networks to deliver and support the Talent Action Programme.
Well,
Thank you.
I think the networks play a really important role of putting this issue on the agenda to start with and continuing to keep permanent secretaries' feet to the fire. And I do attend quite a number of conferences over each year with the networks, and you're always one step ahead of where the status quo is, and that's your job. I think hopefully you will recognise that we're spending more time on this issue now. It's getting much more senior attention. It's on the agenda of the Civil Service Board pretty much every month. But that doesn't mean to say that we want you to hold back. Your job's not complete. As I said earlier, we're not anywhere close to 50-50 yet for women in the senior civil service, and we've got big issues on BME and disability in particular. LGBT, I think we're doing somewhat better. And Matt Hancock, the Minister for the Cabinet Office, has put a new focus also on social class and social background. So, we're very keen to encourage networks, staff networks, to continue to keep us honest on these issues, keep pressing. You play a great role, and long may that continue.
Right, Andrew.
Andrew Kahn, a governor here at the Institute. I remember when working with Richard Mottram 20 years ago under the Major administration on civil service reform, there seemed very little advice, very few places to go to, particularly in this country, for ideas on civil service reform. One of the reasons I think that David Sainsbury set up this institute was precisely that we would offer advice to improve the governance and government of this country. What should this institute do better than we do at the moment to help you in civil service reform? I mean, I don't want a compliment. What are we failing to do in order to achieve better government? What further assistance could we give?
Turn it back on me, Jeremy, yeah.
Yes. Well, to be honest, I probably need a bit more notice of that question. But, I think the civil service and ministers and the opposition have a very good relationship with the IFG. I think it's filled a huge hole. I love the work that you do. Just keep on writing articles about us dispassionately and telling us when we're getting it wrong. It sounds a bit bland, but I can't really think of anything specific off the top of my head, other than just stay as a critical friend. You played a very, very important role in the run-up to the last few elections. The quality of your work, I think, is strong. It's just good to have people who know about the civil service, who care about the civil service and the Constitution, writing intelligent, evidence-based pieces about us.
Can I take up, without getting into too much of a love-in, I certainly don't want to do that, especially for one of my governors, to take up one thing you did mention, which I know you're pursuing, and it's indeed in Civil Service Quarterly, which is the benchmarking. And it's a very interesting point, because you said you go around and you don't do so much of the international thing, because but that you don't feel you've got too much to learn from elsewhere. But of course, historically, there's been quite a lot, certainly on the kind of Commonwealth network. New Zealand was in fashion for a long time. Gus picked up the idea of the Cabinet Manual from New Zealand, but also in practice from there. And there are, for example, Singapore's got, particularly in horizon scanning, there are lots of examples elsewhere where people are able to do things we can't necessarily do here.
But I think benchmarking generally is an area where you probably could help us. Maybe not what you had in mind, but I am very keen. I was talking to Bertelsmann, who are one of the providers of the international benchmarks at the moment, a couple of weeks ago now, and we're encouraging them to get involved in the OECD as well. At the moment, the measures of the effectiveness of a public administration or a civil service are very flawed. For example, I think I'm right in saying the Bertelsmann one doesn't have anything on transparency, has nothing on efficiency, has nothing on innovation. So things which we regard as absolutely fundamental to whether or not we're effective or not are not even measured as part of that one, and that's one of the only two benchmarks that exist. So I would love to see, whether it's the IFG or whether it's Bertelsmann and the IFG or whether it's the World Bank who also produce some, a much better measure that is independent of all of us, of all the dimensions that really matter to taxpayers and ministers and customers of administrations, so that we can actually work out, you know, whether we're doing well or not. Now, on the Bertelsmann one, I think we're number 8. So, you know, according to their measure anyway, we're not anywhere near the best civil service in the world. There's a bunch of Scandinavian countries as usual, probably New Zealand and so on. You know, and I would like to, you know, I'm perfectly prepared in all humility to accept that we're only the 8th best civil service in the world if I actually believe the measures. So that's definitely something you could do. Beyond benchmarking, finding specific things that other countries are doing, whether it's horizon scanning or, you know, a cabinet manual, and bringing those to our attention, yeah, that would be fantastic as well. So, you know, there's definitely specific things you could do, but in general, I think the IFG does a great job. I think it's pitched correctly as, you know, not always, you know, you don't, you know, you're a critical friend. I think that's the best way of putting it. And it's just good, you know, there's a lot of rubbish, frankly, written about the civil service. We know that your stuff will be well-intentioned and evidence-based.
On the horizon scanning point, you said you thought we were in a good position on that, but the strategy unit was effectively abolished 5 years ago. New government entitled to do that. But there seems to be, certainly publicly, less evidence of horizon scanning than there was in the past.
It's been a small function because resources are tight, and we took a very clear decision early on. John Day led this work for me in the civil service. Took a decision that we were never going to be able to replicate the sort of big horizon scanning functions of a Shell or a sort of Warwick University or a McKinsey or whatever, or the CIA. So the task was really just to understand where that very good deep thinking was going on. Make sure that we knew what it was, brought it to the attention of people working in departments on these sorts of issues, and make use of that material. So more of a sort of coordinating and sort of catalytic function than a sort of trying to replicate big horizon scanning work that's already been done very well by many other institutions, both domestic and global. So there's more going on than might appear. The question for me about horizon scanning has never really been, you know, should we do more scenario planning and so on. It's the sort of so what question, as you know, which is, it's great having all these sort of scenarios and great thinking about what might happen in 2050. How does it affect what we do now? Or, you know, even if it's only in a small way, how should it influence our thinking about today's issues? Because particularly when you're trying to take, you know, cumulatively 20 or 40% out of your department, you just don't have the luxury to have people sitting around thinking about things which ministers aren't remotely interested in and never will be. So it's got to be relevant to, you know, resource allocation now, or, you know, making sure our policies are resilient to different scenarios, and trying to get the people who are great at scenario planning to connect more effectively with the people who are doing policy. That is the challenge, and it doesn't require armies of people. So I chair a Cabinet Secretary advisory group that tries to bring together permanent secretaries with the horizon scanners or with the horizon scanning material that we've identified, and constantly ask that question. How, in the light of this sort of, you know, portfolio of new technologies, for example, how does that affect the way the Department for Transport should do anything? You know, and actually it's been quite useful because we have, I think, got ahead of the curve more rapidly on things like drones or autonomous vehicles and the Internet of Things and so on. But the real challenge is not to get lots of sort of wacky presentations about the future. It is to actually then connect it in to Whitehall and ministers. That's the tricky bit.
As we come to the end, there's several questions. Sue Street first, then I'll do the group here.
Thank you. Sue Street, former civil servant. I had 2 questions. The first was yes, no, and I know what the answer is, but I'll ask it anyway, which is, would you care to comment on the Chilcot inquiry?
No.
The second is a bit more incoherent, but paying tribute to Richard Wilson. When he used to travel around the country, we all got incredibly excited about what he stood for. And many civil servants would say also of Gus, for example, that the sort of talk of pride and passion and so on, although it's not technical, is quite inspiring. And I wonder what you would like your cadre of civil servants to be saying about your leadership in that regard.
To be honest, I would like them to say the same. I mean, obviously I'm not as polished or practiced as Richard or Gus, but you know, I am learning my way into that part of the job. But I do think it is a very important part of the job to inspire and inject passion into what we do. So you probably didn't see me in Bristol yesterday at Civil Service Live, but no, I was really trying to talk to them about leadership and about the importance of what we'd achieved in the last Parliament. I'm sure it could be done in a more inspiring way, but it's absolutely vital that people feel pride in our civil service. The civil servants feel pride in our civil service anyway, because you know I haven't gone on about it today, but you know if you look at what we achieved in the last Parliament under the pressure we were under, I think it's remarkable. And you know every civil service audience I speak to, I say that because I think it's the truth, and they need to hear it from their leader.
And we've got a group of questions there.
Peter Riddell from the Whitehall and Industry Group. You referred, Jeremy, to your spell in the city, and Peter talked about the pressure to get more recruitment into the civil service from outside. Assuming you think it's a good thing to see more flexible career paths in future with movements in both directions between the sectors, what do you think you can do to speed that up, and what barriers do you see to it?
And can we take another one? Because I think we'll take two together.
Hello, Laura Hughes from The Telegraph. I was wondering if I could get your personal view on whether or not you believe Britain is best staying in the EU, and if you were happy with the rules that were decided for PERDA coming up to the referendum. Thank you.
Sorry, I didn't miss the detail of the second question.
The
PERDA rules, right? Okay, so on my views on the European Union, I'm going to keep those to myself. I serve the elected government and the British people, obviously, post a referendum. On PERDA, well, we had advice from our legal advisors that it would be difficult to maintain exactly the same rules as usual in the context of the last 4 weeks of a European referendum, given that there's business as usual going on in Europe all the time, which we don't control. You know, obviously, if it's a purely domestic referendum, everything's under our control, and we can just sort of shut off about the issues that are business as usual and let the referendum take centre stage. That's not the case with the European Union. Parliament has taken a different view, and in the end, the civil service will, of course, be guided by what Parliament decides the government can do. And then, you know, once that's settled, that will determine the shape of PERDA, the PERDA rules that I will establish at that point. So, you know, the bill's still going through Parliament, and we'll see where it ends up. On Peter's question, well, we've got a very active interchange policy programme going on, which I think is the best we've ever had, actually. But it's still small in scale, because it takes a long time to sort of fix up these really good middle management interchange opportunities, so that there are worthwhile jobs at both ends, as it were. But obviously, working with WIG and others, we're very, very keen to sort of see if that can be expanded, because it is very important. And I think in general, I mentioned earlier that amongst the many things the civil service is going to have to do differently over the medium term, I think become less London-centric is one. Becoming more porous is another, because I don't think we're going to be having as many people coming in at age 21 and working for 30 odd years or 40 years. People will want a more, at least the option of a more in and out career. And I think we need to be able to offer all those different sorts of career opportunities. Some people, I mean, I've had quite an in and out career actually in a funny sort of way, but I'd like people to think if they're joining the civil service, they can have 3 or 4 or 5 good years. They can be trained up as an apprentice or a fast streamer, or just a regular entry into the civil service. They could leave for a while and have a very good chance of coming back in mid-career, going out and so on. I think you benefit from that sort of person, as well as people who want to make an entire career in the civil service. So very happy to work with WIG and other organisations to make that possible.
Right, no, I think one gentleman there and last one here.
My name's Ian Dilks. I chair a body called the NHS Litigation Authority, and given my question, I should declare I have done that for 18 months, having joined from the private sector. There have been a number of people come in from the private sector to parts of the machinery of government in the last few years. We've touched a bit on this evening, people like John Manzoni. I'd be interested in your views on how effective or useful that's been, and assuming you don't give it 10 out of 10, what might be done to improve it. And I don't mean to be tongue-in-cheek, but as a rider, do you think that the private sector could and should learn more from the civil service?
Well, yes. I think that some parts of the private sector, anyway, could learn a lot from our values. But equally, there's some very, very fine private sector organisations as well, so one doesn't want to generalise too much. Look, there are people who've been very successful coming into the civil service from outside, from the private sector, and there's some people who haven't really sort of enjoyed it and just haven't got on. I mean, there are both. I'm very passionately committed to opening up the civil service to external competition. I think our presumption should be that senior jobs should be openly advertised. I don't think we can afford to be complacent about the talent we've got. So I would like to make it easier for people to come in and have a successful career. I went into Morgan Stanley mid-career, and I was really helped by having senior mentoring in that organisation. But it's not easy for someone who's got a totally different career to go into a different institution in a different sector and be successful. It requires hard work. I think we spend a lot of time on our sort of recruitment practices. The Civil Service Commission do a superb job in making sure we do that fairly and meritocratically and so on. We don't spend enough time making sure the first 6 months of someone from outside civil service career is successful. So I think that's probably the area we've got to work on, because as I say, we have many very good examples of people who've landed well, who've loved it, and have gone on to become permanent secretaries. We've got some other examples of people who just felt at sea, didn't understand the jargon, didn't understand the secret language, just didn't really get on, and that's a failure of the civil service. Because I very passionately believe we need to be open to all the talents. It's not just a diversity issue, it's a difference issue. I really want to see more people from the private sector and more civil servants showing how brilliant the civil service is to the private sector, because again, most of the feedback you get when civil servants go on to comment to a private sector company is, my goodness me, that was a talented person. And that gives me huge pride, because I think we have an absolutely vital, as the Prime Minister said in I think the Conservative Party manifesto, a great national asset in the civil service, and the more people who know about it, the better.
Right. Final question.
No, just cut.
Oh, fine. Right. Well, Jeremy, thank you very much indeed for revealing how you spend 48 hours a day. How on earth you squeeze it in? Your private office at the back will can explain it. For instance, you see another pie chart in a year of how things have changed in the new environment on that. You've been very frank, open in discussing what your role has involved, and I'm very, very grateful for you coming to the Institute, as always, and we look forward to seeing you again here. So if everyone could join me in thanking Sir Jeremy Heywood.